Good evening. How wonderful to see all of you here tonight on what feels like an October rather than August evening in Michigan. I'm Ann Curzan. I'm a professor of English, linguistics, and education at the University of Michigan. You may also recognize my voice from the program That's What They Say on Michigan Radio on Sunday mornings. Thank you. And if you do listen to me on the radio, you may right now be having that weird experience when you encounter a radio presenter and you think, that is not what you look like in my head. It is truly an honor for me to be on the stage tonight to introduce and to have a conversation with tonight's speaker about her new book, What Happened. And I know that you are not here tonight to listen to me recount the many remarkable accomplishments of Hillary Rodham Clinton. That would take more than the hour that we have, and you came to hear her. So I will simply say that we are delighted to have here in Ann Arbor tonight the former senator from New York, the former Secretary of State, the former First Lady, and the first woman ever to receive the presidential nomination from a major political party. But please join me in welcoming to the stage Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you so much. This is a beautiful space. Thank you all. Wow. Woo. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Wow. Oh, my goodness. This is great being back here. I really thank you for that extraordinary warm welcome. I am thrilled to be here and to have a chance to make a few remarks and then to have a conversation with Ann. Those of you who follow her on radio or maybe saw her TED Talk know that she is an expert in the English language. That is a little bit daunting, but I will do my very best. You know, I couldn't help but think, as I was on my way here, that I've had a lot of truly special moments in Michigan over many, many years. Just in the 2016 election, I had the chance in Detroit to celebrate businesses like Shinola that are creating jobs and new opportunity in America. I remember visiting Futuramic in Warren, a former auto manufacturing plant, where I got to talk with workers helping to build a rocket that would go literally from Macomb to Mars. And I heard directly from President Obama that his campaign stop here in Ann Arbor was really one for the history books. So am deeply grateful for the support I received in Michigan, and I want to give a special shout out to the Hillary Clinton fan club. Now, for those of you who don't know, this group started back in the early 90s, right in the beginning of my husband's first term. And I've so enjoyed coming to Ann Arbor and meeting them over the years, getting letters from them. And I was sort of reminiscing, looking at, some of the pictures that we have from those gatherings. And look, the outcome in Michigan was not what I hoped or worked for. Let me just tell you that. But I want today, as I talk about the book I wrote, to really urge everyone, do not grow weary. We have a lot of work to do to stand up for the values that we share and the causes we believe in. That is more important now here in Michigan and across America than it's ever been. So. Now, I'm really glad to be here to talk about what happened. As I write in the book, in the past, I really did feel like I had to be careful in public and, pretty much keep my guard up. Well, those days are over, my friends. And what I try to do is pull back the curtain on one of the wildest elections in American history. I do talk about some of the moments that still frustrate me, including in a chapter called Those Damn Emails. But I also talk about moments I will remember forever, like the way it felt to stand on the stage in Philadelphia to accept the Democratic Party's nomination for president. Or even the final whirlwind swing of the campaign, including an exhilarating rally in Grand Rapids where I talked about my vision to get the economy working for everybody, not just those at the top. So I'm really still proud of the campaign we ran and the 65.8 million Americans who supported it. And yes, writing this book was sometimes a very painful process. It turned out to be cathartic for me and ultimately reinvigorating because as a person, when people ask me how I am, I say, I'm okay. But as an American, I'm really concerned. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book is because it's as much about the future as the past. And I think there are lessons that apply to everyone, either in a personal or a political way. And I want to touch briefly on 4 tonight. First, everyone gets knocked down, like on trips, like I was in London, and walking down a flight of stairs, trying to drink a cup of coffee, carry on a conversation at the same time, wearing heels. Well, it didn't work out so well for me, but what matters is whether you get back up and keep going. And since Election Day, one of the most common questions I get asked is, how did you even get out of bed? And I'll admit, as I write in the book, there were times when I was very tempted just to pull the covers up over my head. But instead, I did spend time with friends and family. I read a lot, especially mystery novels that, have an ending that usually is good. The bad guy gets his comeuppance, So I watched HGTV. I went into a frenzy of organizing and cleaning closets. I played with my dogs. I did some yoga, including alternate nostril breathing, which I highly recommend. And yes, I had my fair share of Chardonnay, so. I also started a new organization called Onward Together to encourage the outpouring of activism and engagement that we're seeing right now. Now, nothing makes me feel better than channeling my frustrations into action, and I hope many of you have come to the same conclusion, because our future depends on it. And here in Michigan, you know a little something about resilience from the revival of the American auto industry to right here in Ann Arbor, where innovation is on the rise at high-tech firms and research labs. So we've got to keep going, but we also have to remember those who are being left behind. That's why I talk about Flint and coming to meet with Mayor Weaver and families whose children had been drinking and bathing in poison water. You know, those families still face very difficult circumstances. The lead levels in the water are going down, which is encouraging, but it could still be a year or more before people can drink from their faucets. It's just heartbreaking and outrageous. This is not something that should ever happen in America, period. And 6 officials of the state, including the head of Michigan's health department, have been charged with involuntary manslaughter. And we know that, you know, there are still problems with the school. There aren't enough jobs. Too many children are not given the health care and nutrition they need. So we've got to stay focused, both on what we can do to accelerate and make exciting the future, but also to try to provide as much help as possible, because we know that what happened in Flint wouldn't happen in an affluent community. We're seeing the same thing happen right now in Puerto Rico, aren't we? Where we've got the same kind of problems, and we need to pay attention to them. And I thank the determination of families in Flint and the mayor and activists and others who refuse to stop speaking out, and the rest of us should be doing what we can to help. So it's not only about what we need to do in politics, although I'll say more about that in the conversation, that's really key. It's also about what we can do on a personal level. The second lesson is this: the only way we will get sexism out of politics is to get more women into politics. Tried to take on the endemic sexism and misogyny in our society, and in a chapter called On Being a Woman in Politics, address some of the experiences that I and other women in the public arena have had. But it's deeper and broader than that. The research is pretty clear. For men, likability and professional success go hand in hand. In other words, the more successful a man becomes, the more people like him. But with women, it's the exact opposite. The more professionally successful we are, the less people like us. And maybe some of you in this room have an inkling about what I'm discussing here. And I would add that not only that, women are seen favorably when we advocate for others, but unfavorably when we advocate for ourselves. And that really struck a chord with me, as I explain in the book, because historically, people like me when I'm in a supporting role. Think about it. Serving as First Lady, serving the people of New York in the Senate, serving as President Obama's Secretary of State. When I left the State Department, my favorability was 69%. Now, but when a woman steps forward and says, now I'd like a chance to lead, everything changes. And I can't think of a single woman in politics who doesn't have stories to tell, not one, on every level, federal, state, local. So yes, there are plenty of reasons why being a woman in politics can be downright infuriating, but it can also be deeply rewarding. You know, just by being at the table, you're bringing a perspective that might otherwise never be mentioned. So I hope women of all ages will read this book and be inspired to run for office, to compete, to get into the public arena. And I intend to do everything I can to help. Now, the third lesson of this book is also one that's very close to my heart. There is no such thing as an alternative fact. And obviously, I've given a lot of thought to this since the election, because the Russian disinformation campaign during the 2016 election was successful in part because America's natural defenses had been worn down over years by powerful interests and voices that wanted to make it harder to distinguish between fact and fiction. When leaders deny things we can see with our own eyes, like the size of a crowd at the inauguration, or when they refuse to accept settled science when it comes to urgent challenges like climate change, it is not just frustrating to everyone who prides ourselves on living in the fact-based universe. It is insidious, and it is subversive to democracy. And one of the points I make in the book is how essential it is at places like this great university, but in our everyday lives, to stand up for facts and evidence, to demand proof, to try to figure out the best we can to come to decisions that are rooted in reason. Now, the fourth and final lesson I want to mention is this. The forces at work in the 2016 election are still with us. Now, that was a perfect storm. Deep currents of anger and resentment flowing through our culture. A political press that told voters my emails were the most important story. The unprecedented intervention in our election by the director of the FBI. And the information warfare waged against us from the Kremlin. Now, what we've learned about Russian interference in the election is more than alarming. It's a clear and present danger to Western democracy, and it is right out of Vladimir Putin's playbook. Here's some of what we already know. We know that Russian agents used Facebook, Twitter, Google, YouTube, even Pinterest to place targeted attack ads and negative stories intended not only to lie about me and to hurt me with voters, but to fan the flames of division within American society. Russians posed as Americans. They pretended to be LGBT activists, gun rights activists. They even held phony demonstrations. And what's more, the propaganda was aimed directly at undecided voters, so-called soft Clinton supporters, who might be persuaded to back a third-party candidate or not vote at all. In fact, we learned recently that some of those Facebook ads specifically targeted voters in Michigan and Wisconsin. One study found that here in Michigan, nearly half of all political news on Twitter in the final days before the election was false or misleading propaganda. You all probably know somebody who saw it and thought, well, gosh, I can't vote for her. Facebook is now the biggest news platform in the world. So if something comes up in your feed, you read it, you pay attention to it. The Russians knew that, the Trump campaign knew that. But this isn't just about what happened. It's about what's happening right now. The Russians are still playing on anything and everything they can to turn Americans against each other. So this is bigger than one candidate, one election, or even one country. Now, I was encouraged that a few months ago, over the president's objections, Congress passed bipartisan legislation to ratchet up sanctions against Russia because of their interference in our election. And earlier this month, Senator McCain rightly took the president to task for missing key deadlines in implementing those sanctions and failing to enforce the law. Even Attorney General Sessions himself says the administration is doing virtually nothing to prevent future attacks. I don't care whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, I don't care. If you are an American, this should alarm you. It is shameful. The president swore an oath to faithfully execute the law and defend our Constitution, and he should start doing his job. And the rest of us have to keep up the pressure. No foreign power in modern history has attacked us with so few consequences, and that puts us all at risk. Russia's weapons of choice may not be tanks or missiles, but let's not mince words. This is a new kind of Cold War, and it is just getting started. So where do we go from here? Now, I don't have all the answers, but I wrote this book in part to lay out some of the questions, to provide my best understanding, and to really provoke a debate. I know when it comes to Russia, we've got to get serious about cybersecurity, get tough with Putin, and get to the bottom of what really happened in 2016. And beyond that, we must insist on truth and accuracy and hold elected leaders and the press accountable when they fail to meet that standard. We also must refuse to be silent in the face of racism, sexism, bigotry, or rhetoric intended to incite hate and violence. And we must summon the courage to stand up for human rights and democracy. And most of all, we must vote in every election. Everybody in Michigan knows every vote matters, and we can't take anything for granted. And I know there are some people who think, okay, the election's over, let's move on. Well, I'm here to tell you, we cannot just move on. We have to learn these lessons because they will help us determine whether we can protect democracy here or anywhere in the world, because these are not one-off events. There are forces at work that will continue to fight against freedom, against democracy, against human rights, LGBT rights, civil rights, women's rights, every value that we hold dear. So I'm going to do everything I can to keep going forward as a citizen, speaking out, and I'm not going anywhere except right into the middle of the debate about our future. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
Well, thank you for giving us so much to think about in those comments and in the book. And I know that and we collected comments, and that came up a lot in the comments. So I know you've heard this before, but as a reader, I was both overwhelmed and galvanized in reliving the 2016 election with you. And you've talked about letting your guard down in the book, and as a reader, I appreciated the personal responses and details that you shared with us as readers. And as a linguist, I wanted to note that I appreciated the way you talked about the double bind that women can find themselves in as speakers, where they are navigating this terrain where we can be criticized if we are asserting ourselves as being aggressive or shrill or worse, and then if we don't assert ourselves, we can be criticized for being weak or not having a position or being too emotional. I was actually talking with students about it a couple of weeks ago in my class, because the linguist Deborah Cameron calls it the constant policing of women's voices.
Yes, yes.
And happens with like and uptalk that you get a lot of policing. And if we have time, I'd love to come back to that. But I actually want to start with a question that comes from me as an English professor who works with students on writing. And one of the things that I emphasize for students is that we write to find out what we think,
right.
Not just to share what
right.
we already think we know.
Right.
And that in the process of writing, we can change our mind, we can come to a conclusion we couldn't get to when all the thoughts were swirling around up here. So I wanted to ask you about writing your book, and if you could share with us something that in the process of writing the book, you came to think about differently or changed your mind about. Where did you start and where did you end?
It's a great question. And, you know, for me, I did not expect I would write a book right after the election at all. You know, I was pretty devastated and shocked about what had happened. And then I began seeing people writing analyses and offering their opinions about what happened. Some of it rang true, and some of it just did not. It didn't correspond with what I had experienced during the campaign. So I began to think, and you're absolutely right, Ann, the process of writing turned for me into the process of understanding what I really thought about what happened. And I decided I would do it both because I was, you know, really anxious to figure it out the best I could, and because I thought I owed it to, you know, people who had worked for me, volunteered for me, voted for me. So when I started, the one thing I knew, and I knew it both viscerally and I knew it from research, is that what Jim Comey did on October 28th was determinative, that his letter disrupted my momentum and really caused a lot of voters to question whether they could support me. And that was particularly true among women voters, Democrats and Republicans, because coming out of the 3 debates, we could see that, you know, I was picking up support among women and even some Republican women, and that stopped it. I knew that, and I knew I needed to try to understand how that happened. What I did not know, and only came to understand by diving into the book, was the full extent of what Russia had done. And we knew that they had stolen emails from the DNC. We knew, starting on October 7th, that they had stolen my campaign chairman, John Podesta's emails. But I did not understand, as much as I learned in the process of the book, what it meant to weaponize information. And it was revelatory for me, but so just sickening. And as I said in my opening remarks, the use of literally propaganda, much of it stimulated by the Russians in concert with WikiLeaks, and taking, you know, really very banal emails from John Podesta and making things up about them. I didn't know how much of an impact that it had on voters. And the more I dug into it, the more information that came to light during the writing of it, because I started in February, and I had to let go of my manuscript in early July. That was eye-opening to me. And there were other things like the role of, voter suppression. I knew sexism and misogyny had been present because I was experiencing that and I was watching it in real time. But the Russian role, the voter suppression role, I learned a lot about that. And it just set me off, because I thought, we didn't know about that, and maybe there was more we could have learned. I'm always open to that. But the way that it was used was unique. It was unprecedented, and that's why I'm trying to sound the alarm about it.
And so you write about that in the book, and it came up in some of the questions that we got from the audience. There was an article, I know you read the New York Times in the morning, and there was an article this morning about the 3 congressional committees who are investigating Russia's role in the 2016 election. And as I was reading that, I was listening to National Public Radio that was talking about a story about regulating online advertising. I guess my question for you, in the book you quote James Clapper as saying that this is worse than Watergate, and Harry Reid is saying that this is the biggest threat since the Cold War. Why do you think we're having so much trouble maintaining sort of a sustained outrage about this?
Well, I think there are several reasons, and obviously I've given a lot of thought to this, because if the roles had been reversed and I had ended up in the White House, knowing what we have now learned about what the Russians did, I would have created an independent commission with subpoena power to get to the bottom of it, because I would have felt, as president, I had a responsibility to try to understand what the Russians had done so that we knew what steps needed to be taken. I think what we're seeing is the inability of a lot of people to really get their heads around what this means. I mean, it's so unprecedented. It's hard if you have never lived in the midst of a propaganda campaign. I think part of the reason that the Europeans were so ready to contest it after they saw what happened to me is because they have lived with, Russian propaganda attacks, with suborning officials, with creating phony front groups, and all the stuff that they've had to try to combat over time. But we haven't. There have been, examples here and there, but nothing like a concerted campaign as we saw in 2016. It takes a while for people to accept something that has never happened before. You come up with a million different explanations. I think the second thing is the tech companies were very slow to accept responsibility. And it became pretty clear that something had gone on, and the first thing Facebook said was, oh, we have found 450 sites and we think they're Russian related, we've shut them down. And then you read that they shut down 50,000 Russian sites in France. You kind of go, 450, 50,000, you got more work to do. And so we're slowly peeling that onion, trying to figure out, okay, what should they have done? What could they have done? What did they know? When did they know it? And how are they going to protect our democracy from these attacks using their platforms? So until that became accepted information by the tech companies coming forward, I think there was still a lot of denial and room for denial. Third, obviously, is the gridlock and the partisan problems we have in our Congress. It is, I think, a very dangerous assumption that certain Republicans seem to be making, that because the Russians helped Republicans and Trump this time, that they will always be on the Republican side. That is not how Vladimir Putin thinks. One of the reasons I mentioned the sanctions bill is that, Trump really admires authoritarians. I've said he doesn't just like Putin, he wants to be like Putin. And he also knows he has to do some of Putin's bidding, because he couldn't do everything that it appears they may have promised to do, like remove the existing sanctions that he inherited. So he didn't want to sign the bill that came out of the Republican Congress some months ago that imposed more sanctions in retaliation, in part because of their interference in our election. But what he's doing instead is just not implementing them. And I think there really is a very foolish assumption by a lot of Republicans that they don't need to get to the bottom of this, both because they don't want to raise questions about the legitimacy of the election's outcome, and because they don't want to alienate not just the Russians, but whoever was working with the Russians. Because when you target individual voters in Michigan and Wisconsin, you have to have really good targeting information in order to deliver those messages on Facebook, Twitter, and elsewhere. And finally, I would say that the special counsel is the fallback, the fail-safe position for the Congress. They think, well, you know, we don't have to alienate anybody or make any of our voters upset because, you know, we really don't know what Cambridge Analytica did, and we don't want to get on the wrong side of the Mercers. So we'll just let Bob Mueller deal with all of this. It's a very sad spectacle. Now, clearly, the White House is feeling the pressure, and Republicans in Congress are feeling the pressure. We've had both Bob Corker and today Jeff Flake basically say, we're not going to put up with this. And if we get more people who put country before party, I think that even though it's sort of slow and plodding, some positive changes could actually come about. But I read the same articles, and I know from having been in the Senate for 8 years that the cooperation between the parties has really deteriorated to the great harm of our nation and getting things done. But as more information comes out, as it inevitably will, then I think there may be more of an appetite to come forward with some, some changes that will be bipartisan.
And we hope so. Do you think you're hinting at this a little bit as we look forward? And I appreciate that you're saying it's not only what happened, but what is happening, right, and what may continue to happen. And we think about how do we prevent this kind of interference or try to stop it. Do you see that as a private sector issue, a public sector issue?
Both. And I see it as a federal, state, and local issue. So, look, the whole issue of cyber warfare is also relatively new. I mean, there have been cyber attacks, some of them by nation states, some of them by criminal enterprises. They've been aimed at stealing information. You know, I knew that when I was a senator. I knew it when I was in the State Department, and I knew that there was a constant effort by countries that had adversarial interests to ours to get as much information as they could to try to provide an intelligence base on which to disadvantage us and obviously advantage them. So there's nothing new about that. What is new is the use of information that is stolen. You know, when you referenced the comment about this is worse than Watergate, think about this. Watergate, for those who can remember it, was a physical burglary. Real live people broke into the DNC, right, in person, to try to find and steal information about the leadership of the DNC that could then be used to help the Nixon re-elect campaign. An old-fashioned burglary, and we were all just stunned by it. And it did directly lead to President Nixon leaving office, okay? Now, this has been a cyber attack. So yeah, it's not visible. We can't point to Igor and say, Igor broke into the Democratic National Committee and stole emails. But it's the same thing. To call it hacking really understates what it is. It's theft. And it's theft for the purpose of political influence. Now, we don't know how much communication and coordination, cooperation there was between the Trump campaign, people associated with the Trump campaign, Russians, Russian cutouts, all of that. But here's what we do know, is that Russian intelligence ran an operation against the DNC, stole those emails, and then used them to try to foment, division within the Democratic Party. Now, we got over that, and we had a great convention, and then we, got out into the campaign, and things were going well, we thought. Now, I want to focus your attention on one particular day because it shows, I think, in very stark relief what was actually going on, and that day is October 7th. So on October 7th, here's what happened. In the morning, Jim Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, Jay Johnson, the Secretary of Homeland Security, made a remarkable statement saying that the Russians had stolen information from the DNC and that the Russians were interfering in our election. Now, we did not know everything. We've learned since that the Russians were intruding into state election systems, intruding into voter rolls. I don't think we even know half of what they were doing and how they were using what they obtained. We just don't know. But what we did know, Jim Clapper and Jay Johnson told the world. Okay, that happened in the morning. A few hours later, the Hollywood Access tape came out, where, Trump admitted to being a sexual assaulter. And it just shocked people. And it was all over the news. Within 1 hour of that happening, WikiLeaks, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Russian intelligence, just so you know, they dumped John Podesta, my campaign chairman's, emails. What a coincidence. Hollywood Access, Trump's own words, admitting absolutely intolerable conduct. And then all of a sudden, you've got WikiLeaks. But they didn't just drop them. They had a very well thought out strategy. And this is one of the things, Ann, that I really understood better. So, we were just, really focused on Hollywood Access. And so was the country for about 72 hours. Right? I think 12 women came forward with very specific allegations. Right? But between October 7th and the election, Donald Trump himself mentioned WikiLeaks about 160 times. Now, during the campaign, I was thinking, well, why is he doing this? It seems sort of goofy. Here's why. Because in the world in which we find ourselves, something that you see on the news is not as important as something you think is secret and is being revealed to you. And then when you saw how the Russians and their colleagues weaponized information from the WikiLeaks dumps, in retrospect, it really became so clear. I'll give you just one example. In a run-of-the-mill, boring email, and I don't want to insult John Podesta, but his emails were very boring. As were mine, by the way. Really.
Right, we're all aiming for that.
Yes,
right?
Boring is good. So he's got an email in which he says something like, I'm going to go talk to so-and-so, and I'll stop by and I'll have pizza. Okay. That's what it said. All of a sudden, there's a story on Russia TV, RT, Sputnik, Fox, Breitbart, InfoWars, saying that pizza was code for a child trafficking ring that John and I were running out of the basement of the pizza place. Now you laugh, but I'm telling you this because this is what we were up against, and we did not really understand it. And this is not going to stop. This is an ongoing threat. Then, this information was transported and delivered to people's Facebook pages, their Twitter accounts, a full panoply of information warfare. And it was so dangerous that one of the worst things that happened was a guy in North Carolina who was reading this online decided he would go rescue the children in the basement of the pizza parlor. So he got in his car with his automatic weapons, his AR-15, an assault weapon, and he drove to Washington. And he walked in fully armed to find there was no basement in the pizza place. There were children with their families eating pizza. He actually shot his weapon, scared people out of their minds until the police came and arrested him. So think about what this tells you about the power of information migrating from secret, behind the scenes, to being weaponized, to being personally delivered. And we are only at the beginning of understanding what we are up against with this. So what I learned after the election, when I was trying to sort this whole WikiLeaks thing out, is that in a number of places in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, elsewhere, where there was a sizable number of undecided voters, Google searches for WikiLeaks stories were off the charts. What does that tell you? People were trying to figure things out. I don't hold voters responsible. And they run across these stories, these horrible lies about me. And they think, well, I don't know, I kind of liked her, but I don't think I can vote for her. Oh my God, she runs a child trafficking ring? Oh, I didn't know that about her. So we have a lot of work to do, and part of it is to require full disclosure on anything that gets into a social media account, where it came from and who paid for it.
So let me change gears here and go back to something you were talking about in your opening remarks, and that you devote a chapter to in the book called Women in Politics.
Right.
And I know this is something that a lot of people in the audience want to hear about. We got a lot of questions along these lines. You've been a role model for a lot of women who are interested in running for office. You've also been very open about the personal price that you can pay. This is true of all politicians, and you write about particularly what can happen for women who are running for office. And in the book, you quote Eleanor Roosevelt as saying that women in politics need to develop skin as thick as rhinoceros hide.
Yes.
And I wanted to pause there and to drill down a little bit of how do women who are thinking about running for office, or as you mentioned, really any kind of leadership position in the public arena, how do you develop that skin? And what's the price?
Yeah, no, and I write about this because there is a price. There's a price that you face, and you have to decide how much you're willing to pay. Because when you enter the public arena, as Eleanor Roosevelt said, you're immediately going to be attacked, criticized, questioned. We just don't have enough women in positions of leadership in both the public and the private sector, so that it becomes really unremarkable. You know, there are some great quotes about we will know we have equality when a mediocre woman gets a job just like a mediocre man does, right? So I wanted to be as clear as I could that you have to be really prepared. You've got to go in with your eyes open. I'm thrilled by the number of young people, particularly young women, who are coming to see me. I've been doing book signings across the country, so I've seen thousands and thousands of people, and they tell me they're running, and I'm so proud and excited for them. And I think one of the roles I can play is to try to help prepare them to stand up against what is inevitable. You know, take criticism seriously, but not personally. Not everybody will like your hair. Just get over it, right? You know, I mean, you just have to have a good sense of humor and also the confidence to stand up for yourself and not be knocked off course, you know, by the inevitable questioning that will come. If there were more women on the stage, so people could actually see, you know, we come in all shapes and sizes, and we wear different styles of clothes, but in the Republican primary, there was one woman who, you know, Trump attacked constantly, starting, of course, with her looks, which was so unfair and insulting. He attacked women commentators, and he was really playing into a lot of the stereotypes about women on the public stage. I was obviously the only woman when I ran in 2008, the only woman on the Democratic side in 2016. So I was well aware, and I talk about, you know, some of the incidents of even people who were Democrats, people on my, you know, on my side who would say things that, you know, were pretty much into the stereotypical comments about women. So there are three things that I would urge. Number one, we have to start much earlier with girls, little girls, building their confidence and giving them the tools they need. Obviously, I now have two amazing, wonderful grandchildren, and I am aware of a lot of the research that by the age of 6, girls think boys are smarter than them. They've barely started school. Where did this come from? Obviously, from the family, from the media, from culture, but it's something we have to be aware of, and I think it's got to be part of the long-term solution. Secondly, you know, we've got to quit falling into the trap, which is set by both the far right and the far left, that it's not women they're upset about, it's one particular woman, right? And, you know, obviously, I heard that all the time. Well, you know, I'd vote for another woman. Yeah, name one and actually do it. In the book, I say, okay, I'm out, the election's over. What happens? Immediately they meaning the media, Republicans, others, start turning on Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris and Kirsten Gillibrand and, you know, amazing women that I serve with and that I know. And in fact, you remember when Elizabeth Warren was reading the letter from Coretta Scott King on the floor of the Senate? I know the rules of the Senate. I understand them. I was there for 8 years. She had every right to read that letter, which happened to be about Jeff Sessions, who was being considered for Attorney General. I think that's pretty relevant. And Mitch McConnell basically forces her off the floor. And what wasn't covered, but what came next, is one of her Democratic male colleagues went to his desk, stood up and read the letter, and nobody said a word. And then later on, Kamala Harris was questioning Jeff Sessions in her role as a member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, and she was told to stop talking. And a commentator said she'd been Hilary'd, Y''D. So don't let people get away with this stuff. And that means every single person has to stand up. But you should also know, and I have this in the book, that a very significant majority of Republican men and close to 50%, in the 40s, of Republican women don't really think there should be a woman president. You know, they say, well, we're not excited about having a woman president. You know, Democrats, we're not 100%, but we're better. I mean, we are just so at the mercy of our embedded pictures of what a president looks like. They've all been men, you know, it's kind of hard to think differently, I get that. But that's why it's really important that at all levels of politics, women are prepared. You know, I was actually criticized for being too prepared. Compared to what, you know, I mean. So yeah, you gotta be prepared, and you gotta be ready, and you have to be tough enough, but don't become, you know, so closed off, so bitter, so cynical that you can't remain open to the people you meet, the people you're trying to represent, the people you want to serve. So I think that there's going to be, at least I hope, I think there will be a lot more women stepping forth at all levels, and I really am just trusting that they're going to get more support. And the final thing I'll say is this. Even before I got into the campaign, while I was getting ready to do it, I was told, you know, your toughest audience will be women. Because, you know, Democrats hadn't won white voters since '92. So white men and white women were going to be a struggle. We knew that going in. I actually won more white women than Barack Obama did in 2012, but I still lost white women. And I think there were a number of reasons for that. But it is also clear that a lot of women are very, very worried about their vote for a woman because they want to be sure they're making the right decision. So as I mentioned earlier, when the Comey letter came out, just as one example, it's in the book. If you're a Democrat trying to win Pennsylvania, you have to win Philadelphia by a big margin, which I did. You have to win the Pennsylvania suburbs by the Philadelphia suburbs by a big margin. You have to win Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, which I did. You have to win Scranton and the Northeast Lackawanna County, which I did. Before the Comey letter, I was leading Trump in the Philadelphia suburbs by 26 points. And that was largely driven by women, white women, who were really getting ready to support me because of the debates primarily. I won the Philadelphia suburbs by 13 points, a few points short of what I needed to win the state. And there is no doubt that women had legitimate questions. Again, I don't blame them. I don't blame voters. Like, oh my gosh, maybe she's going to jail after all. And to be fair, to be totally fair, you know, Comey pulled that stunt on me. He's never, ever explained it. At one point, in testifying, he was asked, well, do you think you influence the election outcome? He said, well, if I thought so, I'd be mildly nauseous. Well, I'll tell you, But here's what he didn't tell voters. So there was no ability to compare and contrast. He did not tell voters there was an open FBI counterintelligence investigation into the Trump campaign and their connections with Russia.
Let me circle back to something you said there about we need more women in politics. And I remember I actually got interviewed about you, and the question was, should we call her the lady candidate? I said, no, don't do that. The first woman candidate, the first female candidate for the Democratic Party. And I said, I look forward to the day when she's just a candidate.
Yes, I do too. I do too.
But I want to come back to this question of women in politics and whether you think, is this just a pipeline problem that we need more women coming into politics, or is there a retention problem? Are there institutions we need to set up to provide more support so women stay once they're there?
No, I think it's all of that. I think look, getting into politics is a self-selection. People may come and try to talk you into it, but ultimately you make the decision. And we do need, and that's what I'm excited about now, and supporting groups like Run for Something and Emerge America and others that are doing the work to go out and convince women that they could run and that they should run and that there will be institutions to support them in that running. So it is a recruitment problem. It's a training and support problem. So yes, that's a pipeline problem. But it's also an expectation problem. You know, when you decide you're going to run and you put yourself out there, you are so vulnerable, and you really are searching for the best ways to present yourself, to answer the questions that you're being hammered with. And a lot of campaigns, the way that they've come to be structured, is that the candidate, you know, basically is handled. Like, you know, okay, you go do this, you go do that, do this, do that. And for a lot of women candidates, it's really not quite comfortable. You know, people, like I remember talking to a woman who said, look, I got into politics because I had a child with a disability. That's what I wanted to talk about, because I wanted to tell people I had a child with a disability. I started going to my state legislature. I began arguing that we needed to change laws and accessibility and public education. That's my passion. And I care about a lot of other issues, but that's what I'm really involved in. And she was told, well, you know, don't talk about it too much because, you know, it might make people uncomfortable. You've got a child with a disability, you know, I mean, and all of a sudden, like, you think you know who you are, you think you know what you care about, and you're being told, well, don't talk about that and don't emphasize this. And for a lot of women, we already edit ourselves, like you were saying. You know, we're already wondering, like, oh, you know, how am I coming across, and do they like me, and, you know, all the things we think about. And now, in a modern campaign, you're being edited even more, and you're being stripped of part of why you decided to get in the first place. And then, of course, there's the makeover issue. So, first I will say this, I don't know a woman in politics who hasn't had something done, right? Even if it's just lightening your hair. And Margaret Thatcher, look at early pictures, look at later pictures. So, you know, this is all part of it. But, you know, I think men are told, at least some men are told, you know, your tie's too long, or your... but that's not intensely personal. But to be really kind of run through the ringer, like, you know, well, you could really up your game, and, you know, you need to buy a new wardrobe, and, you know, all that stuff. So by the time a woman actually gets out there, I mean, oh my gosh, she's been, criticized up one side and down the other. So part of what we have to do is basically say, everybody relax. Go, yeah, you do have to be presentable. I mean, I'm not saying don't do that. But just get out there. You were asked to run because, you're active in the PTA, or you were active in fighting for disability rights, or you've really got a great record in your business. So you were asked for a reason. So don't go stripping yourself down and rebuilding something that is not you. So all of that goes into it.
And I sense that question of being handled and can you talk about what you want to talk about is affecting candidates of all genders, and
yes.
that's something we're dealing with. I appreciate you're talking about human moments. We're going to have a little human moment here, which is if someone backstage can bring a watch out, because one of my jobs is to be responsible about time. So we're going to hope that will happen as I switch gears. And magic will happen here. And this actually came up on multiple cards from the questions. I think you're in a town with a huge university where you have a lot of people in their early 20s. And this is a question from Danielle, who says, what would you tell your 22-year-old self?
Yes, well, my 22-year-old self, I would tell that